The first-class cabin froze as Janet Morrison leaned over two young sisters, her voice sharp as glass. "You're not the first people to be hungry. Stop crying." 8-year-old Selena clutched her stuffed elephant, tears streaking down her cheeks, while her sister Simone sat beside her trembling with silent fury. Passengers looked away uneasy, pretending not to see. But one recording phone was already capturing every cruel word, every tear. What Janet didn't know was that these weren't just any children, they were the daughters of the CEO who built the airline she worked for. And by the time they landed, her career would already be over. Welcome back to Black and Bruised Stories. If you're new here, you've just joined a community dedicated to truth, justice, and survival. Show some love by clicking the like and subscribe button. Before we dive deeper into this story, drop a comment where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. Let me take you back to when the food service started, because what happened during that meal service was so outrageous, so blatantly racist, that passengers started recording and a little girl's faith in humanity was shattered right before everyone's eyes. The food service cart had rolled down the aisle with its familiar symphony of clinking dishes and silverware. The aroma of herb-rusted salmon tender beef medallions and fresh artisanal salads filled the first-class cabin as Janet Morrison made her rounds. Her smile was bright and professional, her service impeccable for every passenger she encountered. Every passenger except 12-year-old Simone and 8-year-old Selena Miles in seats 2A and 2B. Janet wheeled her cart directly past the two young black girls without acknowledgement. Not a glance, not a word, nothing. She served the businessman in 1A with genuine warmth, chatting about the weather while presenting his gourmet meal options. She moved to 1B, offering the elderly woman her choice between salmon and beef with practiced hospitality. Rowby row, every passenger received Janet's full attention and their elaborate first-class meals. The couple in 3C got their food with a smile. The family in 4A had their children's dietary restrictions carefully accommodated. Even passengers who were sleeping were gently awakened and offered their meal choices. But Simone and Selena, they might as well have been invisible. "Excuse me," Simone said politely, as Janet wheeled past them again, returning from serving the back of first class. "We haven't received our meals yet." Janet stopped, her expression shifting to one of barely concealed annoyance. She looked down at the girls like they had interrupted something important. "Let me see what we have available," Janet said, her tone already dismissive. She rummaged through her cart with exaggerated effort, pushing aside the beautiful first-class presentations. Finally, she pulled out two small packages that clearly didn't belong with the gourmet service. "Here," Janet announced loudly enough for surrounding passengers to hear. "Crackers and cheese. This is what we have for passengers in your situation." Selena stared at the tiny snack box, then looked around at the elaborate meals everyone else was enjoying. Her 8-year-old mind couldn't process why she and her sister were being treated differently. "Ma'am," Simone said, her voice still respectful, despite the growing knot in her stomach. "We're in first class. Our boarding passes show seats 2A and 2B. That's when Janet's mask of professionalism completely dropped. "Listen, honey," Janet said, her voice carrying across multiple rows. "Some people think they deserve special treatment just because someone bought them fancy tickets. But this airline has policies, and I follow those policies exactly." The businessman in 3A looked up from his salmon, his fork pausing midway to his mouth. The elderly woman in 1B had stopped eating entirely, watching the exchange with a growing alarm. "This is what's appropriate for passengers like you." Janet continued her words, dripping with venom. "You should be grateful you're getting anything at all." That's when Selena started crying. Not the loud wails of a tantrum, but the heartbroken sobs of a child who couldn't understand why a grown-up was being so cruel to her. "Why doesn't she like us?" Selena whispered through her tears. "What did we do wrong?" Janet wasn't finished with her public humiliation. As she continued her service rounds, she made sure every other passenger in first class received the royal treatment coffee service, wine pairings, warm bread rolls, and elaborate desserts. The couple in 3C got chocolate cake with fresh berries. The family in 4A received special children's meals and extra cookies. Simone and Selena watched it all happen around them, still clutching their unopened snack boxes, while everyone else enjoyed a feast fit for royalty. "I'm so hungry," Selena whispered to her sister, her small voice breaking, "and I'm really thirsty too." When Janet passed their row again, now collecting empty plates from satisfied passengers, Selena gathered her courage. "Please, ma'am," the 8-year-old said directly to Janet. "Can I have some water? I'm really thirsty." Janet stopped and looked down at the crying child with complete coldness. "Water service was 30 minutes ago. You should have paid attention." That's when Mrs. Rodriguez in seat 3A had heard enough. "Excuse me, but these children clearly have first-class tickets. Why aren't they receiving the same service as everyone else?" Janet's eyes flashed with rage at being questioned by a passenger. "Ma'am, I'm a professional flight attendant with 15 years of experience. I know how to do my job, and these passengers are receiving exactly the service they're entitled to." Mrs. Rodriguez looked at the two girls, one trying desperately to be brave while comforting her sobbing sister, both still holding their pathetic snack boxes while surrounded by the remnants of everyone else's gourmet experience. But Janet wasn't done. As the meal service officially ended and she prepared to collect the carts, she made one final crushing announcement. "Well, it looks like we've run out of food," Janet said, with mock regret, speaking directly to Simone and Selena. "I guess I forgot about you two during service. That's what happens when you don't speak up at the right time." The cabin fell silent except for Selena's renewed sobs. Passengers stared in shock at Janet's blatant admission of deliberate neglect. That's when Simone opened her small backpack and quietly pulled out 2 packages of crackers she had packed for their trip. 8-year-old Selena was so hungry that she ate the stale crackers, gratefully still crying as she chewed. The sight of 2 well-dressed children in first-class seats eating crackers from their own bags while surrounded by passengers who had enjoyed gourmet meals was more than Mrs. Rodriguez could bear. She discreetly pulled out her phone and started recording. Other passengers began whispering among themselves. The businessman in 3A shook his head in disgust. The elderly woman in 1B looked like she might cry herself. But Janet felt vindicated. She had shown these entitled children their place, and she was proud of it. What happened next would haunt Janet Morrison for the rest of her life. Please hit that subscribe button right now, because this story will restore your faith in consequences and corporate accountability. Have you ever seen discrimination this blatant? And what do you think should happen to employees who abuse their power to target innocent children? Let me know in the comments below. As Selena continued crying and eating stale crackers as Simone tried to comfort her sister while maintaining the dignity their father had taught them, Janet made one final catastrophic mistake. She decided that the crying was too annoying to tolerate anymore. And that's when she put her hands on an 8-year-old child and changed her life forever. "You need to keep quiet right now." Janet snarled, her grip tightening on Selena's shoulder. "You're not the first person to be hungry on a plane, and you won't be the last. This crying stops immediately." What Janet didn't know was that Mrs. Rodriguez's phone was capturing every word, every action. What she also didn't know was that touching that child would trigger a sequence of events that would destroy her career in minutes. Because Simone Miles had finally reached her breaking point, the 12-year-old pulled out her phone with trembling hands and dialed the one number that would change everything. "Daddy," she whispered, "we need help." The man who answered that call wasn't just any concerned father. He was someone with the power to ground planes, fire executives, and change airline policy with a single phone call. And Janet Morrison was about to find out exactly what happened when you discriminated against the wrong children. What came next would shock every passenger on Flight 447 and send ripples through the entire airline industry. Justice was coming, and it was coming fast. With her small hands trembling from both fear and determination, 12-year-old Simone Miles quietly pulled out her phone and dialed the number that had always been her lifeline. Her little sister Selena was still shaking from Janet Morrison's aggressive grip on her shoulder, tears streaming down her 8-year-old face as she clutched her stuffed elephant like it was the only safe thing left in her world. "Daddy." Simone whispered into the phone, her voice barely audible, but carrying the weight of desperation that only comes when a child realizes the adults who are supposed to protect them have failed. "We need help." The voice on the other end immediately shifted from casual warmth to sharp concern. "What's happening, sweetheart? Are you and Selena safe? We're on Flight 447 to Atlanta." Simone continued, her eyes darting nervously toward Janet, who was still hovering nearby, arranging her service cart with the kind of aggressive efficiency that screamed of someone trying to justify their actions through busy work. "The flight attendant, she's being really horrible to us, Daddy. She wouldn't give us food like everyone else, and she just grabbed Selena's shoulder really hard and told her to stop crying when she was hungry." What none of the passengers witnessing this quiet phone conversation could have known was that the man on the other end of that call was David Miles, the founder and CEO of Meridian Airlines. The same David Miles who had built his aviation empire from nothing with one unwavering principle: every single passenger, regardless of their background, age, or appearance, deserved to be treated with absolute dignity and respect. David Miles had started Meridian Airlines 22 years ago after experiencing his own discrimination as a young Asian immigrant trying to build a business in America. Every policy, every training program, every aspect of his company culture was designed to ensure that no passenger would ever feel the humiliation and disrespect that he had once endured. She did what to Selena David's voice carried a tone that had made Fortune 500 executives tremble in boardrooms across the country. A barely controlled fury that his daughters had never heard before. She said, "We don't belong in first class, even though you bought us these tickets," Simone explained. Her composure absolutely remarkable for a child who had just watched her little sister be publicly humiliated and physically intimidated by an adult in a position of authority. She gave everyone else beautiful meals with real plates and everything, but she only gave us these tiny boxes of crackers, like the ones from the coach. And when Selena started crying because she was so hungry, that's when she grabbed her and told her she wasn't the first person to be hungry on a plane. Meanwhile, just 15 ft away, Janet Morrison was completely oblivious to the conversation that was about to destroy her life. She had moved to the galley area where she was holding court with James Rodriguez, the younger flight attendant, regaling him with her version of events and her satisfaction with how she had handled what she called a classic case of entitled passengers who needed a reality check. "I don't care what kind of tickets those kids have," Janet was saying, her voice carrying across the cabin, with the kind of volume that suggested she wanted other passengers to hear and understand her authority. Someone needs to teach them that flying first class doesn't mean you can act however you want or make demands on the crew. The crying, the attitude, the assumption that they deserve special treatment. It's exactly what's wrong with passengers these days. James shifted uncomfortably in the narrow galley space, his 26-year-old conscience wrestling with the scene he had just witnessed. He had been working for Meridian Airlines for only 8 months. But even in that short time, he had absorbed the company's culture of respect and inclusion. What he had seen Janet do to those 2 young girls went against everything he had learned in training. But Janet was his senior supervisor, and he was still on probation. Speaking up could cost him his job, but staying silent was eating at his soul. "I don't know, Janet," James said quietly, glancing back toward the girls who were huddled together in their seats. "They seemed pretty well behaved to me, and they're just kids." "That's your problem right there," Janet snapped, her 15 years of experience giving her the confidence to lecture the younger man. "You're too soft. These passengers can smell weakness, and they'll walk all over you if you let them. Those girls needed to learn a lesson about respect, and I gave them one they won't forget." But while Janet was pontificating about passenger management, Mrs. Zelena Rodriguez in seat 3A was doing something that would change the entire trajectory of this story. She had discreetly positioned her phone to capture not just Janet's continued unprofessional behavior, but also the quiet dignity with which the 2 young girls were handling their ordeal. "Are you getting all of this?" whispered James Patterson, the businessman in seat 3B, who had quietly shifted his position to help shield Mrs. Rodriguez's recording from Janet's view. Every word Elena whispered back, her fingers steady as she documented what was becoming one of the most clear-cut cases of discrimination she had ever witnessed. This is going to go viral, but more importantly, this is going to serve as evidence. What that woman did to those children is unconscionable. Back in row 2, Simone was providing her father with crucial details while keeping her voice at a whisper that wouldn't attract Janet's attention. Flight 447 Meridian Airlines flying from Denver to Atlanta. The flight attendant name tag says Janet Morrison, and she has dark hair and she's wearing a blue uniform. There was a significant pause on the other end of the line, and Simone could hear the unmistakable sound of rapid typing and muffled voices in the background. Her father was clearly multitasking, but she didn't understand the magnitude of what was being set in motion in corporate boardrooms and operations centers across the country. "Sweetheart, I need you to listen to me very carefully." David Miles's voice was controlled, but filled with the kind of barely contained rage that comes when someone threatens your children. "I want you to stay calm. Keep protecting your sister, and whatever you do, don't engage with that flight attendant anymore. Help is coming, and I promise you that what happened to you and Selena today will never ever happen to any other children flying on my airline." "Your airline, Daddy?" Simone asked, confusion evident in her young voice. "I'll explain everything when you land, baby girl. Just hold tight and remember that you and your sister did absolutely nothing wrong. You're perfect exactly as you are." As Simone quietly ended the call and slipped her phone back into her small purse, she had no idea that her father was already on an emergency conference call with his executive team, his legal department, and the operational managers of every major hub in the Meridian Airlines network. "Ladies and gentlemen," David Miles's voice cut through the corporate conference room like a blade. "We have a situation that represents the complete antithesis of everything this company stands for. My daughters, my children, have just been discriminated against, humiliated, and physically intimidated by one of our own employees." The silence on the conference call was deafening. 23 executives, lawyers, and operational managers held their collective breath as they processed what their CEO had just told them. Sir ventured Patricia Williams, the head of human resources. "When you say physically intimidated, I mean that a flight attendant grabbed my 8-year-old daughter's shoulder and told her to stop crying after systematically denying both girls the meal service that every other first-class passenger received." David's voice was deadly calm in the way that every Meridian employee knew consequences were coming. This isn't just poor customer service. This is discrimination. This is child abuse. And this is a complete violation of every value we hold dear as a company. Please hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next will restore your faith in consequences and corporate accountability. Meanwhile, back on Flight 447, Janet Morrison was returning from her galley consultation with renewed confidence and a fresh determination to ensure that these problem passengers understood their place for the remainder of the flight. She approached Rue with the kind of aggressive energy that suggested she viewed this as an opportunity to demonstrate her authority rather than resolve a conflict. "I hope this little experience has taught you girls something important about appropriate airplane behavior," Janet announced as she stopped directly in the aisle next to their seats, her voice deliberately loud enough for passengers in the surrounding rows to hear every word. "Flying is a privilege, not a right. And part of earning that privilege is learning how to conduct yourselves with proper respect for the crew and other passengers." 8-year-old Selena looked up at Janet with eyes that were red and swollen from crying. Her small face a picture of confusion and hurt that would have melted any heart that wasn't already hardened by years of bitterness and resentment. "We were being good," Selena said in the tiniest voice imaginable. "We said please and thank you. We didn't yell or run around. Why are you being so mean to us?" Janet's expression hardened even further, as if Selena's innocent question was somehow evidence of the attitude problem she had convinced herself these children possessed. "Young lady, the fact that you think you are being good is exactly the problem here. Janet replied, her tone dripping with condescension that made several nearby passengers visibly cringe. Good passengers don't make demands on the crew. Good passengers don't cry when they don't get their way. And good passengers certainly don't require special attention and accommodation that takes time away from serving other customers. But Janet's lecture was interrupted by something she hadn't expected. Passenger intervention. "Excuse me," said Dr. Sarah Martinez from Seat 4A, a pediatrician and mother of 3 who had been watching this entire ordeal with growing horror. "I've been observing these children throughout this flight, and they have been absolutely exemplary passengers. They've been quiet, polite, and well-behaved in every possible way. What I've witnessed from you, however, has been completely inappropriate and frankly shocking." Janet whirled around to face Dr. Martinez, her face flushing with anger at being challenged by a passenger. "Ma'am, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I think I know the difference between well-behaved passengers and entitled ones. These children clearly haven't been taught proper airplane etiquette, and it's not my job to cuddle passengers who can't follow basic rules. What rules exactly have they broken?" Demanded Robert Miles, no relation to the girls, a civil rights attorney who had been quietly documenting the entire incident from his seat in row 5. "I've been watching this situation unfold, and I haven't seen these children do anything except politely ask for the meal service they were entitled to and comfort each other when faced with discrimination." The word discrimination hung in the air like a thunderclap, and Janet's confident expression faltered for just a moment before her defensive anger kicked in even stronger. "That's a very serious accusation." Janet said, her voice rising to a level that was beginning to border on unprofessional shouting. "I serve all passengers equally and according to company policy. If some passengers receive different service, it's because they behave differently." But even as Janet doubled down on her position, something was happening throughout the first-class cabin that she was too blinded by her own righteousness to notice. Mrs. Rodriguez had quietly begun sharing her video footage with other passengers via airdrop, and the response was immediate and universal. Shock, outrage, and a growing determination to protect these 2 innocent children from further abuse. James Patterson. The businessman who had been helping shield the recording had immediately forwarded the footage to his wife, who worked in social media marketing. Within minutes, she had posted the video to her Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook accounts with a caption that would soon be shared thousands of times. This Meridian Airlines flight attendant is systematically discriminating against 2 young black girls on Flight 47. This is heartbreaking and unacceptable. These children deserve better. Justice for these kids. Meridian Airlines. Discrimination. But more importantly than social media virality, Mrs. Rodriguez had done something that would prove to be the catalyst for everything that followed. She had tagged Meridian Airlines' official social media accounts in her post, effectively sending the video footage directly to the company's crisis management team. At Meridian's corporate headquarters in Chicago, the social media monitoring team was already on high alert due to the emergency conference call that was still ongoing in the executive boardroom. When Mrs. Rodriguez's video began pinging their systems with mentions and tags, the response was immediate and coordinated. Mr. Miles interrupted Lisa Park, the head of digital communications, as she burst into the conference room with her laptop. "We have visual confirmation of the incident. A passenger has posted video footage of the entire encounter, and it's exactly what your daughters described." The room fell silent as Lisa played the video for the executive team. The footage clearly showed Janet skipping the girls during meal service, offering them inferior food, while everyone else received gourmet meals and culminating with the physical contact that had crossed every possible line. "Dear God," whispered Patricia Williams as she watched Janet grab Selena's shoulder. "This is going to be a public relations nightmare." "No," David Miles said quietly, his voice carrying a finality that made everyone in the room understand that decisions had just been made. "This is going to be a public demonstration of what happens when someone violates our core values. I want Maria Santos on that plane the moment it touches down in Phoenix. I want security standing by, and I want a full investigation team ready to interview every passenger who witnessed this incident." Back on Flight 447, Janet was now facing what felt like a full passenger revolt. But instead of recognizing that her behavior had been inappropriate, she was doubling down and becoming even more aggressive and defensive. "I need everyone to understand something," Janet announced to the entire first-class cabin, using her authority to essentially hold the passengers hostage to her justification speech. "What you're witnessing is not discrimination. What you're seeing is appropriate crew authority being exercised over passengers who are not following proper flight protocols." What protocols demanded Dr. Martinez? The protocol that says children should be denied meal service. The protocol that says crying 8-year-olds should be physically grabbed. I'd love to see those written down somewhere. Janet's face was now bright red with anger and embarrassment, but she was too invested in her position to back down. "Ma'am, if you continue to interfere with crew operations, I'll be forced to report you for disruptive passenger behavior, which is a federal offense." But Janet's threats were falling on deaf ears because the passengers had reached a collective breaking point. They had watched 2 innocent children be systematically abused by someone in a position of authority, and they weren't going to stand for it anymore. Michael Torres, a teacher from Phoenix, stood up from his seat in row 6. "These girls have shown more grace and dignity in the face of your abuse than you've shown in your entire professional capacity. You should be ashamed of yourself." "I've been flying for 30 years, added Margaret Thompson from row 3, "and I have never seen such unprofessional, cruel behavior from any airline employee. This is absolutely unacceptable." But the moment that would later become the most shared clip from Mrs. Rodriguez's video came when little Selena, through her tears, looked up at Janet and asked the question that would break hearts across the internet. "Do you have kids? Would you want someone to be mean to them like you're being mean to us?" The innocence and pain in that 8-year-old's voice created a moment of absolute silence in the cabin. Every passenger, every crew member, everyone who would later watch the video online would feel the gut punch of a child trying to understand cruelty through the only lens that made sense to her: empathy. Janet's response would become the moment that sealed her fate forever. "That question is completely inappropriate, and it shows exactly the kind of entitled attitude that got you into this situation in the first place." The collective gasp from the passengers was audible. Janet Morrison had just dismissed an 8-year-old's plea for basic human kindness as entitled attitude. But while the passengers were grappling with the shocking callousness they had just witnessed, something else was happening that Janet remained completely oblivious to. The consequences of her actions were already being set in motion at the highest levels of the airline industry. Captain Robert Hayes, a 20-year veteran of Meridian Airlines, was receiving priority communication that would change the course of his flight and possibly his career. "Captain Hayes, this is Denver Control with an emergency priority message from Meridian Executive Operations." Captain Hayes immediately sat up straighter in his cockpit seat. In 2 decades of flying, he could count on one hand the number of times he had received a direct communication from the COS office, and never during an active flight. "Go ahead, Denver Control." "Sir, you have 2 passengers in seats 2A and 2B, who are the daughters of David Miles, and founder of Meridian Airlines. We have multiple reports and video evidence of systematic discrimination and inappropriate physical contact by flight attendant Janet Morrison. Supervisor Maria Santos will board your aircraft during the scheduled crew change in Phoenix for immediate investigation and potential crew removal. This situation has executive-level priority." Captain Hayes felt his stomach drop to somewhere around his knees. Janet Morrison. He knew her by reputation. A 15-year veteran with a spotless technical record, but whispered complaints about her attitude towards certain passengers that had never been substantiated enough for disciplinary action. But now it appeared that her prejudices had finally found a target that would expose her behavior for what it really was. "Copy that, Denver. We'll provide full cooperation with the investigation. Should I inform the crew negative on general crew notification? Miss Santos will handle crew management upon boarding. However, you should know that this incident is already gaining significant media attention, and the CEO is personally involved in the response." As Captain Hayes processed this information and began mentally preparing for what was about to become the most challenging crew situation of his career, Janet Morrison was in the galley area, still completely confident that she had handled a difficult situation with appropriate professional authority. "You see what I mean about entitled passengers," Janet was explaining to James, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable with the entire situation. "They think that because they managed to get first-class seats, they can make demands and cause scenes. But I showed them that my cabin has rules and everyone follows those rules equally." James nodded weakly, but internally he was screaming. He had watched Janet systematically discriminate against two children. He had seen her grab an 8-year-old's shoulder, and he had listened to her dismiss their pain and confusion as attitude problems. Everything about the situation went against his training, his conscience, and his basic human decency, but his fear of confronting a senior employee had kept him silent. That silence, James would later realize, had made him complicit in something that would haunt him for years. Meanwhile, throughout the first-class cabin, an unprecedented level of passenger solidarity was forming around Simone and Selena Miles. Dr. Martinez had quietly moved to an empty seat closer to the girls, positioning herself as a protective barrier between them and any further harassment from Janet. Mrs. Rodriguez was systematically documenting every word and action while coordinating with other passengers to ensure multiple angles of evidence. But perhaps most importantly, the passengers were providing something that the girls desperately needed: validation that they had done nothing wrong. "You two are the most well-behaved children I've ever seen on an airplane," whispered Margaret Thompson as she leaned across the aisle. "Your parents should be proud of how you're handling this situation. My daughter is about your age," added Michael Torres. "And I hope that if she ever faced something like this, she would handle it with the same grace and dignity you're showing." 12-year-old Simone was processing all of this adult support while simultaneously trying to protect her little sister and make sense of why someone would treat them so cruelly. Her father had always taught her that people's behavior toward you said nothing about who you are and everything about who they are. But experiencing that principle in real life was harder than understanding it in theory. "Why do you think she's being so mean to us?" Selena whispered to her sister, her 8-year-old brain still trying to find logic in Janet's cruelty. "I think she's hurt inside," Simone replied with wisdom that amazed the passengers who overheard her. "Daddy always says that people who are happy with themselves don't need to make other people feel bad. She must be really sad about something to make us feel sad too. But we didn't do anything to make her sad." Selena protested, her innocent confusion breaking hearts throughout the cabin. "No, we didn't," Simone agreed, pulling her little sister closer. "Sometimes adults have problems that have nothing to do with us, but they take their angry feelings out on us anyway. It's not fair, but it's not about us." What neither girl knew was that their quiet conversation was being overheard by Mrs. Rodriguez's phone, and that their mature, compassionate response to discrimination was already beginning to circulate online as a powerful example of dignity in the face of hatred. But 30,000 FT below them, the consequences of Janet Morrison's actions were spiraling far beyond anything she could have imagined. David Miles was no longer just a concerned father. He was now a CEO dealing with a company crisis that threatened everything he had built over the past 2 decades. "I want a complete review of Janet Morrison's employment file," David was telling his human resources team. "Every complaint, every evaluation, every passenger feedback form. I want to know how someone with these attitudes managed to represent our company for 15 years without being identified and retrained or terminated." So ventured Patricia Williams. "Our records show that Ms. Morrison has never had a substantiated complaint of discrimination. Her technical performance has always been satisfactory, and she's never been involved in any incidents that rose to the level of disciplinary action." "Then our reporting and investigation systems have failed," David replied grimly. "Because what I'm seeing in this video didn't develop overnight. This level of prejudice and cruelty doesn't emerge fully formed. It builds over time, and it gets practiced on passengers who don't have the resources or platform to fight back." The implication hung heavy in the conference room air. How many other passengers had Janet Morrison discriminated against over her 15-year career? How many other children, other families, other travelers had been subjected to her prejudices without anyone in authority noticing or caring enough to intervene? I want a company-wide review of all customer service complaints involving discriminatory treatment. David continued, his voice carrying the weight of a man who was realizing that his company's problems might be deeper than he had known. And I want new training protocols developed that make it crystal clear that this behavior will result in immediate termination, no exceptions, no warnings. But while corporate executives were planning policy changes and disciplinary actions, Janet Morrison remained blissfully unaware that her world was about to collapse. She was actually feeling quite pleased with herself, convinced that she had maintained order and professionalism in the face of difficult passengers and passenger interference. The thing about this job, Janet was explaining to James as they prepared for the descent into Phoenix, is that you have to establish authority early and maintain it consistently. Passengers will test you, especially passengers who think they're special. But if you show any weakness, they'll walk all over you. James nodded politely while internally counting down the minutes until this flight would be over, and he could distance himself from Janet's behavior. He had already decided that he would request a transfer to different routes if it meant never having to work with her again. What neither Janet nor James knew was that Maria Santos Meridian Airlines' most senior flight operations supervisor and a 22-year company veteran was at that very moment reviewing the passenger video footage and preparing for what would likely be the most clear-cut case of employee misconduct she had encountered in her entire career. This is beyond discrimination, Maria was telling her assistant as they prepared to board Flight 447 in Phoenix. This is systematic abuse of children, and it's being documented from multiple angles by multiple witnesses. There's no grey area here, no room for interpretation or context. This woman's career is over, and it should be. Maria Santos had seen a lot in her 2 decades with Meridian Airlines. She had dealt with passenger complaints, crew misconduct, and every imaginable kind of in-flight incident. But watching Janet Morrison grab an 8-year-old's shoulder while telling her that she wasn't the first person to be hungry on a plane had affected Maria on a deeply personal level. Maria had 2 daughters of her own, and the thought of someone treating her children the way Janet had treated Simone and Selena made her physically ill. But more than personal outrage, Maria was experiencing professional horror at the realization that someone wearing a Meridian Airlines uniform had behaved in a way that violated every core principle of the company she loved. As Flight 447 began its descent into Phoenix, the passengers were buzzing with anticipation. Word had quietly spread throughout the first-class cabin that something significant was about to happen, though most didn't know the details of what was being arranged at the corporate level. "I have a feeling that the flight attendant is about to get a very unpleasant surprise," whispered James Patterson to Mrs. Rodriguez. "Good," Elena replied firmly. "What she did to those children is unforgivable, and she needs to face consequences that ensure it never happens again." But the person who remained most oblivious to the gathering storm was Janet Morrison herself. As the plane touched down in Phoenix and taxied to the gate, Janet was actually looking forward to what she assumed would be a routine crew change, followed by vindication when the situation was reviewed by management. "I think today was a good lesson for everyone," Janet told James as they prepared for the crew to change procedures. "The passengers learned that interfering with crew operations has consequences, and those children learned that acting entitled doesn't get you special treatment." James just nodded, too uncomfortable to respond, while silently praying that he would never have to witness anything like this again. What Janet Morrison didn't know, couldn't know, and was about to discover in the most shocking way possible was that her 15-year career with Meridian Airlines was about to end, not with the quiet resignation of a burned-out employee, but with the spectacular public disgrace of someone who had chosen to discriminate against the wrong children on the wrong day in front of the wrong passengers. The aircraft door was about to open, and with it, Janet Morrison's world was about to be turned completely upside down in a moment that would be talked about in aviation industry circles for years to come. Justice was boarding the plane, and it was about to be swift, decisive, and absolutely devastating. If you want to witness the exact moment when Janet Morrison realizes that she just destroyed her career by discriminating against the COS daughters, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next will restore your faith in consequences and corporate accountability. Have you ever seen discrimination this blatant? And what do you think should happen to employees who abuse their power to target innocent children? Let me know in the comments below. What Janet was about to face would shock her to her core and serve as a lesson that treating people with dignity isn't just the right thing to do. It's the only thing to do. The wheels of Flight 447 touched down on the Phoenix tarmac with a gentle bump. But what awaited inside that aircraft was anything but routine. As passengers began gathering their belongings and preparing for what they assumed would be a standard crew change, none of them could have imagined they were about to witness one of the most dramatic moments of corporate justice in aviation history. Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived in Phoenix for a brief stop. Captain Hayes announced over the intercom, his voice carrying an unusual tension that observant passengers might have noticed. We'll be conducting a routine crew inspection during this stop. Please remain seated while airline personnel board the aircraft. Janet Morrison was organizing her service materials in the galley, still completely confident that whatever inspection was about to occur would vindicate her professional handling of what she continued to view as a passenger management situation. She had spent the last 30 minutes of the flight mentally preparing her defense, rehearsing how she would explain to supervisors that she had maintained appropriate boundaries with difficult passengers who were clearly unaccustomed to flying first class. "I hope they review the whole situation objectively," Janet told James as she straightened her uniform and checked her appearance in the small galley mirror. "When they hear about the crying that demands the other passengers interfering with crew operations, they'll understand that I handled everything by the book." James nodded weakly, but his stomach was churning with the knowledge that Janet was about to face something far more serious than a routine review. The other flight attendant had been watching the passenger reactions throughout the flight, had seen Mrs. Rodriguez documenting everything with her phone, and had witnessed the growing solidarity among the travelers who had clearly been horrified by Janet's behavior. But Janet remained oblivious to the storm that was about to engulf her. She actually seemed energized by the prospect of explaining her actions to management. Confident that her 15 years of experience and her technical knowledge of airline protocols would support her version of events. What Janet Morrison didn't know was that at that very moment, Maria Santos was walking across the Phoenix tarmac toward Flight 447, accompanied by 2 airport security officers and carrying a tablet loaded with video evidence that would destroy Janet's career in a matter of minutes. Maria Santos was not just any supervisor. At 54 years old, she was Meridian Airlines' most senior flight operations manager, a woman who had worked her way up from flight attendant to executive leadership over the course of 22 years with the company. She had handled hundreds of crew situations, passenger complaints, and disciplinary matters, but she had never dealt with anything quite like what she was about to confront. This is going to be one of the most clear-cut cases of employee misconduct I've ever investigated. Maria told Officer Jennifer Walsh as they approached the aircraft. "We have multiple passenger witnesses, video documentation, and victims who happen to be the SOS children. There's no ambiguity here, no room for interpretation. This woman's career is over." Officer Walsh, a 15-year veteran of airport security, had seen her share of airline employee misconduct, but the video footage Maria had shown her during their brief preparation meeting had shocked her to her core. "I've never seen anything quite this blatant," she admitted. "Usually these discrimination cases have some element of he said, she said, but this is all documented in real time by multiple sources." As Maria Santos climbed the aircraft stairs and entered Flight 447, every passenger in first class could sense that something significant was about to happen. The tension in the cabin was palpable, a mixture of anticipation, curiosity, and the kind of electric energy that comes when people know they're about to witness justice being served. Maria's first action upon boarding the aircraft was something that Janet Morrison never could have expected. She walked directly to seats 2A and 2B, where Simone and Selena Miles were still sitting quietly, and immediately knelt down to their eye level. Girls, my name is Maria Santos, and I'm a supervisor with Meridian Airlines. She said gently, her voice carrying the warmth and professionalism that had made her one of the company's most respected managers. I want to start by offering you my sincere apologies for what you've experienced on this flight. What happened to you was completely wrong, and it goes against everything our company believes in. 12-year-old Simone looked up at Maria with cautious hope, while 8-year-old Selena peeked out from behind her stuffed elephant, still visibly shaken from her encounter with Janet, but curious about this kind-voiced woman who was speaking to them so respectfully. "Are we in trouble?" Selena asked in her tiny voice. The question breaking Maria's heart because it revealed just how thoroughly Janet's abuse had confused and frightened the little girl. "Oh, sweetheart, no," Maria replied immediately, her voice thick with emotion. "You are not in trouble. You did absolutely nothing wrong. You were perfect passengers, and you should never have been treated the way you were treated today." But Janet Morrison, observing this interaction from the galley area, was growing increasingly confused and concerned. In her 15 years with the company, she had never seen a supervisor board an aircraft and immediately begin apologizing to passengers who had been involved in a disciplinary situation. Something was happening that didn't fit with her understanding of how these matters were typically handled. "Excuse me," Janet said as she approached Maria and the girls, her voice carrying the authoritative tone she had been using throughout the flight. "I think there may be some misunderstanding here. These passengers were disruptive during the flight, and I had to use appropriate crew management techniques to maintain order in the cabin." Maria Santos slowly stood up and turned to face Janet Morrison, and the temperature in the cabin seemed to drop 10 degrees. Every passenger who was watching could see that Maria's expression had shifted from gentle warmth to ice-cold professionalism. "Morrison!" Maria said, her voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that comes from a consummate professional who has been pushed beyond her limit. "We need to talk now." The way Maria emphasized that final words sent a chill through Janet's confidence. This wasn't the routine discussion she had been expecting. This was something else entirely, something that was beginning to feel very much like a confrontation rather than a consultation. Of course, Janet replied, trying to maintain her composure while internally beginning to panic. "I'm happy to discuss my handling of the passenger situation. I think you'll find that I maintained appropriate professional boundaries despite significant provocation." But before Maria could respond, something happened that Janet Morrison never could have anticipated. The passengers themselves began to speak up. "Excuse me," said Dr. Sarah Martinez, rising from her seat in row 4. "I'm a pediatrician, and I witnessed this entire incident. These children were not disruptive in any way. They were polite, quiet, and well-behaved throughout the flight. The flight attendants systematically discriminated against them, denied them meal service, and physically grabbed the younger child. I recorded the entire incident," added Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, holding up her phone. "I have video evidence of everything that happened, including the physical contact with the 8-year-old. "I'm an attorney," said Robert Miles from row 5. "And what I witnessed was systematic discrimination based on race-targeted harassment of minors and conduct that violates both company policy and federal civil rights laws." One by one, passengers throughout first class began providing their testimonies, and Janet Morrison felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. This wasn't a routine crew evaluation. This was something much more serious. Something that was beginning to feel like a trial in which she was the defendant. "These passengers are clearly coordinating their stories." Janet protested desperately, her voice rising with panic. "They've been interfering with crew operations throughout the flight, and now they're trying to create some kind of false narrative to avoid consequences for their own disruptive behavior." But Maria Santos had heard enough. She pulled out her tablet and turned it toward Janet. And what appeared on the screen made Janet's face drain of all color. "Morrison." Maria said, her voice deadly calm. "I want you to watch this video very carefully because it shows exactly what kind of passenger management you've been practicing today." The video began playing, and Janet watched in growing horror as she saw herself systematically skipping the two young girls during meal service, offering them inferior food while serving gourmet meals to other passengers, and culminating with the moment that would destroy her career. The clear footage of her grabbing 8-year-old Selena's shoulder and telling her to stop crying. This video has been viewed by our CEO, our legal team, and our executive board. Maria continued, as Janet stared at the screen in shock. But before we discuss the disciplinary consequences of your actions, there's something else you need to know about these two passengers. Maria paused dramatically, allowing the weight of the moment to build before delivering the revelation that would shatter Janet's world completely. Ms. Morrison meets Simone and Selena Miles. Their father is David Miles, the founder and CEO of Meridian Airlines. You have spent this entire flight discriminating against, humiliating, and physically intimidating the owner's daughters. The silence that followed this revelation was so complete that passengers could hear the air conditioning cycling in the cabin. Janet Morrison's face went from pale to ashen grey as the full magnitude of what Maria had just told her began to sink in. That's impossible. Janet stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. They can't be the Soch. Maria finished for her. The daughters of the man who built this company on principles of respect, dignity, and equal treatment for all passengers. The same man who is currently in an emergency board meeting discussing how to respond to the systematic abuse of his children by one of his own employees. Janet Morrison felt like the world was spinning around her. Everything she thought she knew about the situation, everything she had convinced herself about entitled passengers and appropriate crew management, was crashing down around her in the most catastrophic way possible. "I didn't know," Janet said weakly, as if that somehow explained or excused her behavior. "I had no idea who they were." And that, Maria replied with devastating precision, is exactly the point. It shouldn't matter who they are. It shouldn't matter if their father is the CEO or if he's unemployed. It shouldn't matter if they're flying first class or coach. Every passenger, especially children, deserves to be treated with basic human dignity and respect. The passengers throughout first class were watching this confrontation with a mixture of fascination and satisfaction. They had witnessed systematic discrimination and abuse, and they were now seeing justice being served in real time. You systematically denied meal service to 2 children based on their race. Maria continued, her voice growing stronger with each accusation. You publicly humiliated them in front of other passengers. You made an 8-year-old child cry from hunger and fear. And then, when that traumatized child couldn't stop crying, you physically grabbed her and told her to be quiet. With each point Maria made, Janet seemed to shrink further into herself. The confidence and authority she had displayed throughout the flight were evaporating, replaced by the dawning realization that she had made the biggest mistake of her professional life. There were misunderstandings. Janet tried desperately. I was trying to maintain order in the cabin. Sometimes passenger management requires firm boundaries. Firm boundaries. Maria's voice rose for the first time, her professional composure finally cracking slightly. You put your hands on an 8-year-old child. You made 2 young girls eat crackers from their own bags while serving gourmet meals to every other passenger. You discriminated against children based on the color of their skin. There is no policy, no procedure, no justification in our company manual for that behavior. Mrs. Rodriguez, still recording everything, captured the moment when Janet Morrison's 15-year career came to an official end. Janet Morrison Maria said, her voice returning to its controlled official tone. You are hereby terminated from employment with Meridian Airlines, effective immediately. You will be escorted from this aircraft and banned from all Meridian properties. Your actions today represent the complete opposite of everything this company stands for, and there will be no appeals process for discrimination and child abuse. The words child abuse hit Janet like a physical blow. In all her justifications and rationalizations, she had never thought of her actions in those terms. But hearing them spoken aloud by a company executive made her realize how her behavior would be perceived not just by her employer, but by the public, by other parents, by anyone who saw the video that was already beginning to circulate online. Please Janet said, her voice breaking as the full consequences of her actions began to dawn on her. "I've worked for this company for 15 years. I've never had any serious complaints. This was just a misunderstanding that got out of hand." 15 years, Maria repeated, and there was something in her tone that suggested she was about to deliver another devastating blow. 15 years of representing this company. And this is how you choose to treat passengers. This is how you choose to treat children. Airport security officers Jennifer Walsh and David Kim stepped forward, their presence making it clear that Janet's termination was not open for discussion or negotiation. "Ma'am," Officer Walsh said professionally, "we need you to gather your personal belongings and exit the aircraft immediately." As Janet began collecting her things with shaking hands, something happened that would be remembered by every passenger on that flight for the rest of their lives. 8-year-old Selena Miles, the same little girl who had been crying from hunger and fear just an hour earlier, looked up at Janet with eyes that held no hatred, no desire for revenge, just the pure innocence of a child who didn't yet understand how cruel the world could be. "I hope you learn to be nicer to people," Selena said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent cabin. "Maybe you were just having a really bad day." The impact of those words on everyone present was immediate and profound. Here was a child who had been discriminated against, humiliated, and physically intimidated, offering forgiveness and understanding to the person who had caused her such pain. Janet Morrison stopped gathering her belongings and stared at Selena. And for the first time since boarding this flight, she seemed to truly see the children she had tormented. Not as entitled passengers or discipline problems, but as innocent young people who had done nothing wrong except exist in a space where she had decided they didn't belong. Janet started to speak, but words failed her. What could she possibly say to a child whose grace and forgiveness highlighted the ugliness of her own behavior? "Come on, ma'am," Officer Walsh said gently but firmly. "It's time to go." As Janet Morrison was escorted down the aisle toward the aircraft exit, every passenger in first class watched in silence. Some were shaking their heads in disgust. Others were filming the moment for social media, but most were simply processing the fact that they had witnessed something historic, a clear case of discrimination being met with swift, decisive justice. Dr. Martinez started a slow clap that spread throughout the cabin, not celebrating Janet's downfall, but applauding the fact that the two young girls had finally received the justice they deserved. Captain Hayes, who had been observing the situation from the cockpit doorway, stepped forward to address the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Hayes announced, his voice carrying the authority of 2 decades in aviation. "I want to personally apologize for what you witnessed on this flight today. The behavior you saw from our crew member does not represent the values of Meridian Airlines or the vast majority of our employees who work every day to provide respectful, dignified service to all passengers." He paused, looking directly at Simone and Selena. "To our young passengers in 2A and 2B, I want you to know that you handled this situation with more grace and maturity than many adults would have shown. Your parents should be incredibly proud of the remarkable young women they're raising." As Flight 447 prepared for its final departure to Atlanta, Maria Santos spent several minutes with Simone and Selena, ensuring they had everything they needed for the remainder of their journey. The girls were upgraded to the most premium first-class service available, with flight attendant James personally attending to their every need with the kind of warmth and respect that should have been their experience from the beginning. "Will that lady be okay?" Selena asked Maria as the plane prepared for takeoff. Even after everything she had endured, the 8-year-old was concerned about Janet's well-being. "She'll have to learn some very important lessons about treating people with kindness," Maria replied carefully. "But that's not your responsibility to worry about. Your job is just to be the wonderful, caring person you already are." When Flight 447 finally landed in Atlanta, Simone and Selena were met by their grandmother and a small army of Meridian Airlines executives who wanted to personally apologize for the girls' experience. The video footage captured by Mrs. Rodriguez had already begun circulating on social media, where it was generating millions of views and sparking conversations about discrimination, children's rights, and corporate responsibility. But the story didn't end with Janet Morrison's termination, or even with the girl's safe arrival in Atlanta. The consequences of that flight would ripple through the airline industry for months and years to come. Because in the end, respect isn't about who you know, or what position you hold, or how much power you wield. Respect is about recognizing the fundamental humanity in every person you encounter, especially the most vulnerable among us. If you believe that discrimination should never be tolerated and that children deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, hit that subscribe button now, because stories like this remind us why standing up for what's right matters more than staying comfortable in silence. What would you have done if you were a passenger witnessing this discrimination? Would you have spoken up immediately, or would you have waited to see how the situation developed? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because your voice matters in these conversations about justice and accountability.